Welcome to ADO.NET questions and answer series. And let's start with the first question. What is ADO.NET? And we'll also see a simple example of how to fetch records using connection object, command object, and data reader object. So before we start any kind of demos here, let's first try to understand what is the use of ADO.NET. So let's first start with the most simplest thing. What is the full form of ADO? ADO stands for Active Data Objects. Now ADO is nothing but it's a component in .NET Framework which helps us to fetch data from different data sources to your C# code, or probably you can send data from your C# code to the data sources. So for example, let's say you have your SQL Server, and if you want to fetch data to your C# and VB.NET code, you can use ADO.NET, or if you want to pass data from your C# and VB.NET code back to the data source, you can use ADO.NET. Now before we go ahead and we start demonstrating some examples here, let's first try to understand the architecture of ADO.NET. So here's a simple architecture diagram for ADO.NET. Now ADO.NET comprises of 6 important components: connection, command, data reader, data adapter, data set, and data view. Now from these 6 components, 2 components are compulsory. One is the command object and the other one is the connection object. So irrespective, you are doing an insert, you are doing an update, you are doing a delete, or you are doing a select, command and connection object you will always need. Now the first important component is the connection object. Connection object is needed to connect to your backend data source, which can be SQL Server, it can be Oracle, it can be Access. To create a connection object, you at least need 2 things. One is, where is the data source located? Means some machine name or IP address or some place where the data source is located. And second, security credentials. Is it a Windows authentication, or is it a user ID and a password which we need to connect to the data source? So the first step is to create a connection object, and the connection object helps us to connect to the backend database. The second important component is the command object. Now when we talk about databases, SQL Server, Oracle, Access, any kind of RDBMS, they understand SQL. So command object is where you go and write your SQL, and then later you can take this command object and execute this command object over this connection, and then you can fetch data or you can send data to the database. So the first step is you need to create a connection object which actually makes a connection to your database, and second is you need to write your SQL syntaxes into this command object, and then this command object is fired over this connection. Now from command object onwards, you can go 2 ways. One is you can go the data set way, and the other is you can go the data reader way. Now whichever way you take, right, it depends upon situations. So for now, let's not get into complications of data reader and data set in one go. What we'll do is, in this video, we'll only talk about data reader, and in the coming up videos, I'll talk about data set, data view, and data adapter. So this path, we will not talk in this video. We'll only talk about this path, that is connection, command, and data reader. Now what exactly is a data reader? Data reader is nothing but it's a connected read-only and a forward record set. 3 words which are very important when we talk about data reader: connected, forward only, and read only record set. Okay, and when I demonstrate, I'll tell you what exactly I mean by that. So what we'll do now is we'll do a very small demonstration where we will go and connect to this SQL Server or Oracle, whatever data source we choose, by using the connection object first. We'll write a very simple select statement on this command object, and then from this command object we'll fetch data into this data reader object, and we will try to display that data onto our application. So let us go and do a small demonstration by which we can understand connection, command, and data reader. So here's a simple demonstration for connection, command, and data reader. So you can see that I have a very simple console application here called as console application 4, and I have also created a very simple table here called as TBL customer. So what we like to do is, now we would like to go and fetch the records from this TBL customer table and display the same on this console application over here, right? And while we do that, we are going to demonstrate connection, command, and data reader. So now the first step is we need to go and import the necessary namespaces, by which we can get access to this connection object, command objects, and the data reader object. So the first step is we need to go and import system.data.sql client. So in this namespace system.data.sql client, we can get access to connection object, command object, and the data reader object. So to fetch data, we need to follow 3 steps. The first thing is we need to create a connection object. Second step, we need to create a command object, where we will go and write our SQL syntaxes. And finally, we will get the data into this data reader object, from which we can browse and display the records. So to fetch data from SQL Server, it's a 3-step process. First is connection, command, and then data reader. So the first step is, let's go ahead and create the connection object. And in order to create a connection object, we have to say here SQL connection obj equal to new SQL connection. And as I've already said in the previous part of the video, connection object helps us to connect to the data source. So we have to say here obj.open. And once we have done our work, right, once we have executed our command, we have got the data, we have fetched it, the final thing which we should always do is we should go and close the connection. Now I would like to take some time here out and talk about this open and the close connection statements. It is always a good practice to call the close connection as soon as possible. In other words, open the connection, fire your select statements, insert statements, or whatever things you want to do, get your data into your data set, data reader, whatever it is, and after that close the connection. Don't forget to close the connection, because the time you open the connection, the SQL Server or any data source has to allocate resources to it. And if you don't call the close connection over here, those resources are not released by the data source. And because those resources are not released, what will happen is it will just become cumulative, and then after that the performance will degrade of your RDBMS or your data source or SQL Server, whatever it is. So always remember, open the connection, do your work, and then close the connection. Now, as I've already said previously, that the connection object actually connects to your data source. Now, in order to connect to your data source, you need to also provide, where your data source is running. What is a computer name or some kind of IP address or something, right? Second, you also need to provide the security mode and also the security credentials. So, for example, if you have your SQL Server running under Windows authentication, then you need to provide, the Windows authentication mode, right? Or if your SQL Server is running under user ID and password mode, then you need to specify the user ID and password in the connection object. And all these details are provided to your connection object by using something called as the connection string. So when you are creating your connection object, you can see that in the constructor we have something called as connection string. So we need to provide the connection string which will actually go and connect to this data source, which is running here, or this SQL Server which is running on this computer, that is win-bqberhwwbybh, right? And in that computer, I need to go and connect to this database called as customer, and in that customer database I need to go and connect to this table called as TBL customer, right? So I need to provide the connection string which will help me to specify where my SQL Server is running and also the credentials. So the next question is, from where can we get this connection string? Now I would like to point here one thing. Connection string is very difficult to remember. The structure is very complicated. So let me just go and show you a very nice tip here, how you can go and get the connection string. So click on View, click on Server Explorer, and go and add your database, to this data connection folder over here. So right click, add connection, give your server name, give your credentials, select the database, and say OK. Once you have done that, your database with the server name comes over here. So for example, you can see now this SQL Server, that is win-bqber blah blah blah, is now added over here, and specifically I am connected to the customer database. Now what you can do is click on this customer, this whatever PC name dot database name is over here, and you can see there is a small property window which comes up over here. Very quickly you can see this. So once you've selected over here, now you can see in the property window, you can see there's a property here called as connection string. So select this, copy it, and provide the same into the constructor over here, right? And you can see the connection string over here. So, and if you see the connection string, as I've said, it is very cryptic to remember. So it's saying here, where is the data source located? Localhost. Localhost means in the same local machine. But in case you have your data source located into some other machine, you can provide the IP address or the computer name over here. The next property is the initial catalog, which says, what is the database name. And then after that, we have provided him what kind of security mode we are going to follow. So we have said integrated security. Integrated security means, this SQL server, will validate only those users, or it will only allow those users, who are into this same domain. Okay. So currently I'm into the same PC, so this integrated security true will work. But in case, this was SQL authentication, in other words, it was a user ID and a password, then I need to provide the user ID and password over here. So that is a connection string over there. Also, how to get the connection string, you can see one of the Visual Studio tips we have provided in the tips and tricks section, where you can see that there is one more way I have shown how to get the connection string, for the SQL connection object, right? So now we have the SQL connection object over here. We have opened it, right? Now the next thing is we need to go and create a command object. We need to provide the SQL statement, by which we can go and fetch the data. Now, in order to create the command object, we need to say here SQL command obj command equal to new SQL command. As I've already said in the previous part of the video, that the SQL command or the command object, it has the necessary SQL which we're going to fire on the data source. So currently what we want to do, we want to actually go and fetch these records from the TBL customer table, right? So our SQL statement will be select star from TBL customer, right? So in the SQL command constructor, so if you see in the constructor, right, we can provide here the command text. The command text is nothing but the SQL statement. So I'll say here select star from TBL customer. Now this SQL command cannot run in isolation. It needs the help of the connection object, because remember, the connection object is the only source which actually will help us to identify where the SQL server is. So if this SQL command has to execute, right, he would also need the connection object on which this select command has to be executed, right? So for that, again, if you see the constructor over here of the SQL command, you can see that there are two parameters you can pass in the constructor. One is the command text, which is nothing but your SQL statement, which we have already done, and the next object is the connection object. So we have created here a connection object called as obj. So what we'll do is we'll pass that connection object over here. So now what will happen is this SQL command, this obj command object which we have created, it will actually fire this select star from TBL customer table on this connection object, that is obj, which is connected to this connection string, right? So we have created the connection object, we have provided the necessary SQL statements by using the command object, and this command object is also connected with the connection object. Now the final thing is we would like to go and execute this command object and get the data reader object out. So in order to get the data reader object, what we can do here is we can say here SQL data reader obj reader is equal to obj command dot execute reader. You can see there is a method on the command object called as execute reader. So what will happen is when we call this execute reader, it will go and fire this select statement and it will return back a SQL data reader object. Okay, so I'm going to go and fire this out here, right? And now what I would like to do is once this execute reader is fired, the data will come into this obj reader, right? I would like to loop through this obj reader and I would like to display the records what are fetched. Now in order to read the records, we need to say here while obj reader dot read. Now this read method is like a move next. Move next means, for example, now let's say you have two records, okay, and all these records are fetched here. Now when the records are fetched, the first, the cursor position or the first position of your reader is on the first record. Now if you call the dot read, if you say read, it will go to the second position. If you call again the read, it will go to the next record. So every time you call read, it moves to the next position. And also every time you call this dot read method, it returns true and false depending on you have records or not. For example, let's say you are on the first row here and you call a dot read, this will return true. You can see here read, it returns boolean, bool, right? So when you call a dot read here, it will return true. If you again call a dot read, it moves to the next row, it will return true. After that, when you call a dot read, there are no more records existing, right? It will return false. So what I'm saying here is that read this records until this returns false. So you can say while obj reader dot read. So while it is true, keep on looping here. But the time there are no records, exit and close the connection and exit this application. Now while these records are read here, or while this loop is moving on here, I would like to go and display the customer code and customer name. If you remember, right, we have two fields in this table here, customer code and customer name. So as this loop is going on, I would like to go and display customer code and customer. So in order to display the records, we can say here console dot write line obj reader, and here we can specify either the index of the column. Index of the column means, for example, now we have two columns here, right? So customer code will be denoted by 0 and the customer name will be denoted by 1, or either we can specify the field name. So what we'll do is we'll specify the field name, because that would make the code more cleaner, right? So I'll say here the first column is customer code and with some spaces. The second column is customer name, right? And what I'll also do is I'll just do a console.read line here so that we can see the results, or else what will happen is this application will just execute this and close off, right? So I'm going to just do a console.read line so we can see the output. Okay, let's go and build this application. I hope there are no defects. Build started, and there it is, build succeeded. Good. And now let me do a control F5. Let's see. There it is. Now you can see it has displayed the records from the table. So in our table we have two records for now, very quickly, and this is our application. So you can see that he has fetched those records and displayed it on our C# application. So this was a very simple demonstration of connection, command and data reader. So in the next video we'll talk about data set, data adapter and data views.